Heavy boots crunched against the dry earth, breaking the silence of our clearing.
The Wolf Clan warriors marched in with their heads held high, forming a jagged line that cut through the center of our camp.
They stopped a few paces from the fire. 5 of our women sat huddled there,
shoulders hunched, staring into the flickering light. The warriors looked at them and sneered.
Their expressions twisted with easy contempt. They saw only starving targets.
They did not see the tension in the fingers gripping the ground, nor the way the air shifted when they stepped into our space. The Wolf Clan leader stepped forward,
his eyes darting between the women, as if they were already spoils of war. He let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the surrounding rock walls. He seemed amused by our stillness, by our silence.
He did not look at the shadows. He did not look at the brush. He looked only at Voss, who sat closest to the flames. He reached for the hilt of a rusted blade at his hip, his movements slow and dripping with arrogance. He was certain there would be no resistance. He was wrong.
The leader stepped closer, his shadow falling over Voss like a shroud. He did not rush. He enjoyed the way the light played off the jagged, rusted metal of his blade as he drew it from his side. The sound of steel scraping leather was harsh, biting into the quiet of the morning. He held the tip of the weapon inches from her throat. He laughed again, a dry, grating sound that made the air feel thin. He seemed to relish the way Voss held her breath, her eyes tracking the blade with wide, unblinking focus. He prodded the air in front of her, testing her resolve, waiting for her to break. He gestured for the other women to stand, his voice a low, gravelly command that demanded absolute obedience. He was a predator playing with prey that he believed was already caught. He turned his head slightly, scanning the camp with a sneer, confident that his display of force had shattered any hope of defiance. He did not notice the way the nearby grass remained still. He did not see the subtle shift in the shadows behind the rock wall. He was entirely focused on the kill. He raised the blade higher, ready to strike, completely unaware that his time had already run out.
From my vantage point behind the jagged rock wall, I watched the leader reach for his weapon. His arrogance was absolute, a blind spot that would be his undoing. I tightened my grip on the staff, feeling the rough wood bite into my palms. It was time. I shifted my focus to the shadows where Mira waited. She was a coiled spring, every muscle held in perfect, rigid tension, her body primed for the exact second I gave the command.
She did not breathe. She did not twitch. She simply waited for the rhythm to break. I looked across the perimeter,
scanning the dark recesses of the brush where my hunters crouched in the dirt. They were no longer the starving, broken people the Wolf Clan had expected to find. They were a phalanx in the making, their eyes fixed on the intruders with a cold, singular purpose. I took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of the moment press against my chest. I glanced at Mira one last time. She saw me. She moved her weight, shifting her center of gravity, her eyes widening as she prepared to launch herself into the fray. The silence of the camp was heavy, thick with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. I stood ready. The signal was on the tip of my tongue, and the Wolf Clan had no idea that they were standing in the middle of a trap. The Wolf Clan leader turned his back to the brush, convinced he was the only predator in the clearing. He did not smell the 30 warriors crouched within the foliage. He could not, because we had stripped away our own scent. We had spent hours coating every inch of skin with thick, heavy river mud. It was a cold,
suffocating layer that acted as a barrier, sealing in our natural heat and blocking the pungent musk that usually gave us away.
The mud was more than a layer of earth. It was our invisibility. It muted our presence, turning us into mere shadows against the damp forest floor. The Wolf Clan warriors stood only yards away, their nostrils twitching as they scanned the clearing. But they found nothing. They smelled only the damp soil and the fading embers of our fire. They were blind to the hunters watching them from the periphery. The tactical advantage was absolute. We were not standing in the open. We were part of the landscape itself. Every warrior held their position, covered in the gray, drying clay. waiting for the precise moment the trap would spring.
The invaders thought they were hunting prey, but they were already walking through a graveyard of their own making.
The mud held us together, silent and lethal, as the distance between the predator and the trap closed to nothing. The forest had fallen into a deep, heavy silence that felt heavier than the mountain air. It was a vacuum. Even the birds had ceased their calls, leaving the clearing to the rhythmic, mocking laughter of the wolf clan leader. He stood in the center of the camp, his head tilted as if listening for a challenge that refused to come. He did not realize that the silence was not a lack of life, but a predatory hold. Every tree, every shadow, every blade of grass seemed to be watching him, waiting for the signal. I watched him from the brush, observing the way he shifted his weight, his arrogance slowly curdling into a flicker of unease. He stopped laughing. He looked toward the perimeter, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the stillness. He sensed something was wrong with the rhythm of the woods, but he could not see the 30 hunters poised just inches from his reach. The tension in the air was palpable. A tight wire stretched to the point of snapping. My tribe did not stir. They held their breath, their muscles locked, their focus narrowing down to the singular point of the attack. We were the forest now. The invaders were no longer the hunters. They were the targets, standing in the center of a killing ground they had wandered into without a single glance behind them. The wolf clan leader took another step toward Voss. He reached out, his hand extended,
closing the gap between his arrogance and her vulnerability. I was hidden, but my reach was already extending through the wood in my hands.
I gripped the fire-hardened spear. I squeezed until my knuckles turned white, the rough, charred surface of the wood biting into my skin. This was not the life I had known before, a life of mundane failures and cold comfort. That life was gone. Here, there was only the tension of the spear shaft, the solid resistance of the ground beneath my feet, and the absolute clarity of what had to be done. My blood hammered against my ribs, steady and rhythmic. I felt the weight of the tribe behind me, their collective breath held in the dark. I checked the balance of the spear one last time. My grip tightened further, my fingers locking around the wood as if they were fused to it. The leader was close enough to touch her now. The air in the clearing felt thin, pressurized by the anticipation of the strike. I felt every fiber of my resolve solidify. I was no longer a bystander in my own existence. I was the source of the coming storm. I watched the leader, I felt the spear, and I waited for the signal that would end their dominance forever. The leader pivoted on his heel, his back now turned to the dense brush where Mira crouched. He chuckled again, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the clearing. He remained entirely oblivious to the wall of shadows surrounding his squad. He scanned the camp, looking for fear, looking for submission, but he saw only the stillness of the trees. He did not smell the damp earth on our skin. He did not hear the 30 heartbeats sinking into a single predatory rhythm. Behind the rock wall, Mira shifted her weight. She did not make a sound. She was a coiled spring, held in place by absolute discipline. The mud smeared thick across our bodies masked our presence, turning us into extensions of the forest floor itself. We were not waiting for luck. We were waiting for the inevitable mistake. The Wolf Clan warriors stood clustered together, their attention fixed on their leader, their weapons held loosely at their sides. They were comfortable in their superiority. They were blind to the hunters who had already mapped their every movement. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Every second the leader spent posturing was another second we closed the circle. The trap was not just set, it was closing. We were invisible, we were everywhere, and we were ready. My mind drifted for a fraction of a heartbeat. I remembered a time before this, a life defined by the hum of an office and the frustration of a broken fan. I had been a man who watched the world happen to him. I had been a man who measured his impact in spreadsheets and quiet complaints. That version of me was a ghost now. Here, The air was thick with the scent of pine and impending violence. Here, my influence was measured in the tension of a spear tip and the synchronized breath of a tribe. The contrast was absolute. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was the architect of the outcome. I felt the cold, hard wood of the staff against my palm, a stark reminder of the transition from observer to actor. I had spent a lifetime waiting for permission to change my reality. I did not need it anymore. I looked at the mud-slicked faces of my hunters, then back to the leader, who still thought he was the apex predator in this clearing. He was standing on a foundation of sand, and I was the one holding the shovel. The shift was complete. My pulse slowed to a steady, rhythmic thrum. I was ready to break the world he thought he understood. The Wolf Clan leader took a step forward, his boots crunching loudly against the dry leaves. He was closing the gap now. Voss remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the ground, but her hands were steady.
The leader laughed again, a mocking sound that echoed against the rock wall. He reached out,
his hand extending toward her, his fingers curling in a gesture of blatant ownership. He was inches away. The air in the clearing felt heavy, as if the very pressure of the atmosphere were building toward a snap.
I watched him from the shadows, my grip tightening on the staff until my knuckles turned white.
Every muscle in my body was coiled, vibrating with the need to move. Mira was barely breathing beside me, her eyes locked on the leader's exposed side. He was arrogant, distracted, and entirely convinced of his own dominance. He took one more step, his weight shifting forward, leaving him overextended and vulnerable. The moment he reached the final distance, I lifted the staff. I felt the weight of the wood, the texture of the grain under my palms, and the promise of the coming impact. The silence was no longer empty. It was a weapon.
I held the staff high, ready to hammer the earth and shatter this fragile piece.
The fingers of the Wolf Clan leader hovered just inches from Voss. Time seemed to drag, each tick of the pulse feeling like a hammer blow against the silence. I watched the leader's head tilt, his eyes searching for fear that simply was not there. The forest had gone deathly quiet. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable. My hunters were statues in the brush, their muscles locked, their gazes fixed on the back of the leader's neck. I kept my eyes on the staff, feeling the vibration of the earth under my feet. The leader shifted his weight again, his hand twitching forward, closing the final fraction of an inch toward his target. He was so close that I could hear the rasp of his breathing over the rustle of the wind. Every detail of the clearing sharpened into focus, the dust motes dancing in a sliver of light, the rigid set of Voss's shoulders, the way the leader's own men stood idle, oblivious to the coil of violence ready to snap. I did not blink. I did not move. I waited for the exact instant his balance would fail him. The world held its breath. I held the staff. The silence was absolute, a void waiting to be filled by the sound of war.
I drove the staff into the hard-packed earth with everything I had. The sound echoed like a thunderclap, sharp and absolute. The silence was dead. From the shadows of the brush, my hunters erupted in a single, fluid motion. They were no longer the ragged survivors the Wolf Clan expected to find. They were a tide of steel and intent. The Wolf Clan leader froze, his hand still reaching for Voss, but his eyes darted wide as the forest floor came alive. Arrows whistled through the air, finding their marks before the intruders could even reach for their blades. I saw their faces shift from mockery to terror in the span of a heartbeat. The camp, once a scene of impending victimization, transformed into a slaughterhouse of our own design. My hunters moved with a predatory grace, closing the distance and cutting off every avenue of retreat. The Wolf Clan warriors stumbled, tripped by the very ground they had stood upon with such arrogance moments before. They were caught in a crossfire of precise, black-tipped spears. The power dynamic did not just shift, it shattered. We were no longer waiting for the end. We were the ones dictating the tempo of the fight. The intruders had walked into a trap, And now, the jaws were closing.
The Wolf Clan warriors scrambled, clawing at their hilts, but they were fighting ghosts. They expected panic.
They expected screams. Instead, they slammed into a wall of iron-willed discipline. My hunters moved as one, a single, shifting organism of lethal intent. They did not rush blindly. They stepped in lockstep, shields and spears forming a seamless barrier that pushed the invaders back toward the perimeter. I watched from the brush as the Wolf Clan leader tried to rally his men, his orders lost in the rhythmic thud of our boots. They were used to chasing down prey, not facing a professional phalanx. Every time they lunged, a spearhead met them. Every time they retreated, the wall advanced. The look of confusion on their faces was total. They had come to feast on the weak, but they were being systematically dismantled by an army they did not recognize. There was no chaos in our ranks, only the cold, precise execution of the tactics I had drilled into them. The Wolf Clan's arrogance evaporated, replaced by the realization that they were no longer the predators. They were being herded, trapped by a force that moved with the calculated efficiency of a machine. The fight was no longer a skirmish. It was a demonstration of absolute tactical control. The invaders reached for their rusted steel, fingers fumbling at their sides. They never got the chance to pull them free. From the surrounding brush, the air hummed with the sound of incoming projectiles. A barrage of black-tipped spears arced through the morning light, converging on the center of the camp. It was not a chaotic volley. It was a calculated grid of steel. The Wolf Clan warriors froze, their hands still hovering over their hilts, as the first spears struck the ground inches from their feet. Then came the second wave, lower, faster, and lethal. One spear caught the leader's shoulder, spinning him halfway around and forcing him to drop his blade into the dirt. The crossfire was absolute. Every path the intruders took to escape was blocked by a flying shaft of fire-hardened wood and sharpened stone. They were caught in a web of our making. No matter which way they turned, another spear point greeted them, forcing them into a tight, panicked cluster. They stood paralyzed, trapped by the sheer volume of our reach. Their eyes darted from side to side, searching for a gap that did not exist. The tactical advantage had shifted completely. We did not need to be close to end them. We had turned the entire clearing into a kill zone. Senna moved with the fluidity of a striking snake, her unit trailing behind her like a shadow. They swung wide, cutting off the southern perimeter before the invaders could even register the movement. The Wolf Clan warriors backed away, looking for an exit, but found only the cold, sharpened points of our forged spears. Senna struck the ground with her blade, a signal that sent her unit forward in a tight, disciplined arc. They did not just stand. They advanced, grinding the invaders against the jagged rock wall of the camp. The Wolf Clan raised their rusted tools in a desperate attempt to parry, but the impact was sickening. Our spears, hardened by the precise fire forging I had taught, shattered their defenses. The invaders were pinned, pushed back until their heels dug into the dirt, trapped between the unforgiving rock and the unwavering line of my hunters. Every thrust from Senna's squad was a testament to the new order I had built. They used the tools I had designed to dictate the terms of the fight. The Wolf Clan's space shrank with every measured step my warriors took. They were no longer fighting men. They were fighting the ingenuity I had poured into this tribe. The perimeter was sealed. The trap was shut. There was nowhere left to retreat. The arrogance of the Wolf Clan vanished, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of the condemned. They stopped fighting back. Their chests heaved, not from exertion, but from the sudden, suffocating realization that the camp was a tomb.
The leader lunged forward once, a wild, swinging arc of rusted steel aimed at nothing.
But he stumbled, tripping over the bodies of his own fallen scouts. He hit the dirt hard. He did not scramble up. He looked around, seeing the circle of my hunters tightening, their faces smeared in mud, their eyes cold and unblinking. There was no mercy in that formation, only the mechanical efficiency I had instilled. The invaders dropped their weapons. The metallic clatter echoed against the rock walls, a final admission of defeat. They huddled together, shoulders hunched, trying to shrink away from the encroaching line of spears. Their breathing turned into sharp, ragged gasps. They had come for an easy massacre, expecting to find starving women and a broken camp. Instead, they found a slaughterhouse. The terror was palpable, a thick, sour scent that rose from their sweating skin. They were no longer warriors. They were broken things, waiting for the final strike. The silence of the forest returned, heavier than before, suffocating the last remnants of their pride. The breaking point was not a command, but a collective, primal urge to survive. The wolf clan leader was the first to bolt, his legs churning through the loose soil as he abandoned his kin. He did not look back. Panic became a contagion, spreading through the remaining warriors like a wildfire. They discarded their remaining gear, weapons clattering against stones, as they scrambled toward the dense wall of the forest. My hunters held their positions, watching with the cold, unyielding patience of stone statues. We did not chase. We did not need to. The sight of their backs, hunched and frantic, was enough. They tore through the brush, branches snapping under their weight as they dove into the shadows. Their desperate cries were swallowed by the deep, dark foliage. One by one, the last of the intruders vanished into the tangled undergrowth, their presence erased from the camp perimeter. The chaotic thud of their retreat faded into the distance until only the wind remained. They were gone, leaving behind only the wreckage of their failed raid. The field was ours. The silence that followed was not the silence of fear, but the heavy, ironclad silence of a total and absolute victory. We stood as a wall, watching the dark canopy where they had disappeared, our spears steady in the morning air. The heavy, humid air of the clearing began to thin. A sliver of golden light pierced the dense canopy overhead, slicing through the lingering haze of the morning. It hit the ground, illuminating the trampled earth where the invaders had stood only moments before. The light expanded, creeping across the camp like a rising tide, washing away the shadows of the struggle. It caught the tips of our spears, turning the black-tipped iron into points of blinding white fire. I watched as the warmth reached the center of the village. The hunters stood motionless, their faces still caked in mud, but the light gave them a new, sharp clarity. They were no longer silhouettes in the dark. They were a force carved into the landscape. The sun climbed higher, flooding the camp with an uncompromising, brilliant glow. It touched the rows of weapons, the scattered debris of the wolf clan, and the steady, unblinking faces of my people. This was not just the end of a battle. The light signaled a shift in the world itself. The cold, desperate fear that had once defined our existence was being burned away by the morning heat. We stood in the center of that brilliance, waiting for the world to recognize the change. The dawn had arrived, and with it, the undeniable weight of our new authority. The light held the clearing in a suspended, golden stillness. No one moved. The hunters kept their spears braced, their eyes scanning the perimeter for any lingering threat, but the forest remained silent. In the center of the camp, Voss stepped forward into the open. She looked at the rows of iron-tipped weapons, then at the scattered remnants of the defeated intruders, and finally toward the shade where I stood. Her breathing was uneven, a sharp, rhythmic sound in the quiet. She took one step, then another, her gaze fixed on the ground. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her movements carried the weight of a long, crushing history of survival finally coming to a halt. When she reached the center of the clearing, she stopped. She slowly sank to her knees, the impact of her weight against the hard-packed earth echoing in the stillness. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead directly into the grit and dust of the camp floor. It was a gesture of absolute surrender, a total abandonment of her previous stance. She remained there, motionless, a singular point of profound gratitude and recognition. The tribe watched, their faces unreadable, as the power dynamic of the entire camp shifted in that single silent act. The earth beneath her was stained with the remnants of the fight, but she did not flinch. She stayed anchored to the ground, waiting for me to acknowledge the new order. Daka moved through the ranks of the hunters, her stride heavy and deliberate. Her graying temples caught the early morning light as she stopped before the kneeling figure. She looked down at the earth, then shifted her gaze to the rows of spears. With a single, sharp nod, she acknowledged the pact. The tension that had held the camp in a vice grip finally began to dissipate. I watched them from the deep shade of my shelter, the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke clinging to my skin. My hands were steady, gripped firmly around the rough wood of my staff. It felt strange to consider the distance I had traveled. In my previous life, I had been nothing more than a victim of a common household appliance. A life ended by a mechanical failure in a sterile room. Here, the reality was blood, iron, and fire. I was no longer that man. I had become the architect of their survival, the one who turned their desperate hunger into a sharpened weapon. Mira sat beside me, her tail rhythmically brushing the dirt floor. She leaned her weight against my shoulder, her ears swiveling to capture the shifting sounds of the camp. I looked at the fire, at the rows of spears, and finally toward the horizon. I had carved the future into this savage world, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of the torch I was holding. I pushed myself to my feet, the ground firm and solid beneath my boots. The transition from the shaded interior of the shelter to the bright, open clearing felt like stepping into a new reality. I gripped my spear, feeling the balance of the wood and the bite of the stone tip against my palm. Across the camp, the silence broke. One by one, the hunters turned. They did not look at me with the frantic desperation of the starving, but with the steady, focused intensity of soldiers. I was no longer a ghost of a past life, a man defined by a freak accident in a quiet room. I was the architect of this survival. I walked toward the center of the village, my steps measured and deliberate. The dust kicked up by my movement hung in the morning sun, gilding the path ahead. Every eye followed me. Every breath in the camp seemed to wait for my next word. I stopped where the fire had burned down to glowing embers, the center of their world. The future was not something I had found. It was something I had forged with iron and will. I looked at the spear in my hand, then at the people who looked to me for direction. I was ready. The torch was in my hands, and I would not let it go out.